Alex Murdaugh told investigators he was not at the kennels when his wife and son were killed. For almost 2 years, that was the story. He was at the house. He took a nap. He left to visit his mother. He came back and found Maggie and Paul near the kennels. That was the story he gave police. That was the story his surviving son heard. That was the story he carried into one of the most watched murder trials in America. Then Paul Murdaugh's phone was unlocked. Inside that phone was a short video, a simple video, a dog near the kennels, voices in the background, nothing dramatic at first, no confession, no warning, no long explanation. But in that short recording, investigators heard something Alex Murdaugh said was not possible. They heard his voice, the voice of the man who said he was not there, the voice of the husband, the voice of the father. The voice of the lawyer who had built his life on trust, influence, and control. And from that moment, the case changed, because the question was no longer only who killed Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. The question became much darker. Why would a man lie about being with his wife and son just minutes before they were found dead? And why did that lie sit at the center of a case filled with money, power, missing funds, a boat crash lawsuit, a collapsing legal career, and a family name that had ruled one corner of South Carolina for generations? This is the documented story of Alex Murdaugh, Maggie Murdaugh, and Paul Murdaugh. A story where one emergency call became the opening act, one phone video became the turning point, and one appeal now asks whether the verdict that shocked America should survive. Before we go deeper, support true crime investigator Alex by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. This story is built from documented records and public reporting, and your support helps bring more fact-based true crime investigations to the screen. On the night of June 7, 2021, the first public version of the story came from Alex Murdaugh himself. He called emergency services and said he had found his wife Maggie and his youngest son Paul at the family property on Moselle Road in Islandton, South Carolina. The property was large, private, and deeply tied to the family's lifestyle. There was a house, there were kennels, there was land, there was distance from the outside world. And in the first minutes of the emergency call, Alex presented himself as a man who had returned home to the worst sight a husband and father could face. He said his wife and son had been shot. He asked for help. He told the dispatcher where he was. He sounded shaken. He also began offering a possible reason for what had happened. He mentioned the boat crash. He said his son Paul had been getting threats. That detail mattered, because Paul Murdaugh was already known in South Carolina for another tragedy. In February 2019, Mallory Beach, a 19-year-old woman, died after a boat crash involving Paul Murdaugh. Paul later faced boating under the influence charges. He denied guilt. The case had not gone to trial when Paul and Maggie were killed. The Beach family also pursued civil claims. Those legal actions created pressure around the Murdaugh family. And after Maggie and Paul were found dead, Alex pointed toward that pressure almost immediately. He suggested that anger connected to the boat crash may have followed Paul home. It was an idea that could redirect attention away from him. A revenge theory, a threat theory, a story where outsiders came to Moselle. But investigators had to answer a harder question. Was that explanation supported by the evidence? Or was it the first part of a controlled narrative? At the beginning, the scene was confusing. The family name carried weight. The Murdaughs were not ordinary private citizens in South Carolina's Low Country. For decades, members of the Murdaugh family held major legal power in the region. The family had deep ties to prosecution, law, influence, and local trust. Alex Murdaugh was a lawyer. His family name had opened doors for generations. In the public eye, he came from a world where people knew who the Murdaughs were before they knew the facts. That history made the case feel larger than a double murder. It felt like the collapse of a system. But on June 7th, none of that answered the most urgent question. Who was with Maggie and Paul before they died? Alex told investigators he had been away from the kennels. He said he had been at the house. He said he had left for his mother's home. He said he returned and found the bodies. That timeline mattered because the killings happened in a narrow window. The state would later argue that Maggie and Paul were alive at the kennels shortly before they were killed. The state would also argue that Alex was there with them. If Alex was there, then his early statements were not a small mistake. They were a major lie. And for a lawyer, lies carry weight. Alex knew language. He knew timelines. He knew what investigators listened for. He knew how statements become evidence. He had spent his career inside the legal world. That made his early explanation even more important. He was not a confused stranger to criminal law. He was a man trained to understand what words can do. The investigation moved through phones, vehicle data, witness statements, timelines, and family history. At first, the case did not have the kind of evidence people expect in a simple murder story. There was no public confession. The weapons used in the murders were not recovered as trial evidence. There was no eyewitness standing in court to say they saw Alex shoot Maggie and Paul. The prosecution would later build the case on circumstantial evidence. But circumstantial evidence can be powerful when the pieces connect. A timeline can speak. A phone can speak. A vehicle can speak. A lie can speak. And in this case, the evidence that changed everything was not found in a dramatic hidden room. It was in Paul's phone. Paul had recorded a video near the kennels. The video was not made to solve a murder. It was ordinary. He was recording a dog. He planned to send it to a friend. The moment was small, a normal detail from a normal evening, but the timing made it enormous. The video was recorded shortly before Maggie and Paul died. And in the background, witnesses later identified the voices of Maggie, Paul, and Alex. That meant Alex was at the kennels. That meant he was near Maggie and Paul close to the time they were killed. And that meant his story to law enforcement was false. For jurors, that video became one of the clearest pieces of the case. Not because it showed violence, it did not. Not because it showed a weapon, it did not. But because it showed presence. It placed Alex where he had denied being. The state did not need the video to show everything. It needed the video to break one thing, the alibi. Once the alibi broke, the rest of the story became harder for the defense to explain. Why lie about the last time you saw your wife and son alive? Why keep that lie for so long? Why tell investigators, family, and the public a version of the night that left out your presence at the exact place where everything happened? Alex would later take the stand and admit he lied. He said he had been at the kennels. He said he had not told the truth because of paranoia tied to his opioid addiction. He admitted financial crimes. He admitted stealing from people who trusted him. He admitted he had lied again and again. But he denied killing Maggie and Paul. That became one of the central tensions of the trial. The jury watched a man admit to many lies, then ask them to believe one final denial. To understand why prosecutors believed money mattered, the story has to move backward. Before June 7, 2021, Alex Murdaugh's life looked strong from the outside. He had a known family name. He had a law career. He had property. He had access. He had status. But prosecutors argued that behind that image, his world was under extreme pressure. There were questions about missing money. There were clients who had been cheated. There were law firm concerns. There was the civil pressure connected to the boat crash. There were financial obligations closing in. The prosecution's theory was not that money alone explains every detail of a murder. Their theory was that exposure was coming. And exposure, for a man whose life depended on control and image, was dangerous. The financial evidence became one of the most debated parts of the trial. The defense argued that the state was using financial crimes to make the jury dislike Alex, even if those crimes did not prove murder. The prosecution argued that the financial evidence explained motive. They wanted jurors to see the pressure building around him. They wanted jurors to understand why the day of the killings mattered. They wanted jurors to connect the collapse of his professional life to the violence at Moselle. Judge Clifton Newman allowed financial crime evidence into the trial. That decision helped shape the entire case. It also became part of the appeal fight, because if a murder trial becomes filled with evidence about theft, fraud, and betrayal, the legal question becomes sharp. Did that evidence explain motive, or did it unfairly prejudice the jury? That question has followed the case long after the guilty verdict. But during trial, the financial evidence gave prosecutors a way to tell the jury that Alex's life was not stable. It was cracking. One major pressure point was the boat crash case. The death of Mallory Beach had already drawn public attention to Paul Murdaugh and the Murdaugh family. The civil case threatened to expose financial information. For someone trying to hide stolen money, public financial discovery could be devastating. The state argued that Alex was not just facing embarrassment, he was facing exposure. On the day of the killings, Alex was also confronted at his law firm about missing money. That detail became part of the prosecution's timeline. The state's argument was simple in structure, but heavy in meaning. Pressure was rising. His secrets were moving closer to the surface. Then Maggie and Paul were killed. After that, attention shifted. People were no longer asking only about missing money or lawsuits. They were looking at a grieving husband and father. That was the state's theory. A tragedy became a shield. The defense rejected that idea. Alex's lawyers argued that the state had no direct evidence proving he pulled the trigger. They challenged the investigation. They attacked assumptions. They questioned the timeline. They argued that the financial evidence did not prove murder. They pointed to mistakes and gaps. And they reminded the jury that suspicion is not proof. That is why the kennel video mattered so much. It did not answer every question, but it answered one of the most important ones. Alex was there, and he had said he was not. The case also became a story about behavior. Investigators and viewers paid close attention to what Alex said after he called for help. They looked at how quickly he mentioned the boat crash. They looked at his body cam statements. They looked at his questions. They looked at his clothes. They looked at whether his reactions matched what people expected from a husband and father. But behavior is dangerous ground. People grieve differently. Shock does strange things. A true crime story should not convict someone because they cry too much or too little. The stronger point is not emotion. The stronger point is evidence. And the evidence kept bringing the story back to the timeline. The phone records, the vehicle data, the kennel video, the shifting statements, the admissions on the stand. The case did not rise or fall on whether Alex looked believable in one moment. It rose or fell on whether the jury believed the state had connected the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury said yes. But before the verdict, Alex made a decision that changed the trial. He testified. For a defendant in a murder case, taking the stand is risky. For Alex Murdaugh, it was especially risky because prosecutors had more than one subject to question him about. They could question the night of the killings. They could question the kennel lie. They could question his financial crimes. They could question years of deception. On the stand, Alex admitted he lied to investigators about being at the kennels. He admitted he stole money. He admitted he had betrayed clients. He admitted he had lied to people close to him. But he kept saying he did not kill Maggie and Paul. That testimony gave jurors a direct look at him. It gave prosecutors a chance to confront him. It gave the defense a chance to humanize him. And it gave the case one of its sharpest contradictions. Alex wanted the jury to believe that he lied about everything surrounding the worst night of his life, but not about the most important thing. He lied about where he was. He lied about money. He lied to clients. He lied to colleagues. He lied to investigators. But he asked the jury to believe that he was telling the truth when he said he did not kill his wife and son. For the prosecution, that was the heart of the case. For the defense, the answer was different. They argued that a liar is not automatically a murderer. They argued that addiction, fear, and panic can explain lies. They argued that the state was using Alex's financial crimes to fill holes in a murder case. They argued that the prosecution had built a story, not proof. That conflict gave the trial its tension. Not every piece was simple. Not every question had a clean answer. But the jury's decision came fast. After a 6-week trial, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found Alex Murdaugh guilty on all counts. 2 counts of murder. 2 weapons charges connected to the killings. The next day, Judge Newman sentenced him to life in prison. The verdict looked final. America watched as a man from a powerful legal family was convicted of killing his wife and son. But in law, a verdict is not always the end. Sometimes it becomes the beginning of another fight. And in the Murdaugh case, that next fight carried a new name: Becky Hill. The court clerk from the trial became central to Alex Murdaugh's attempt to get a new trial. His lawyers accused her of improper contact with jurors. They argued that her actions may have influenced the verdict. The issue became explosive because a courtroom must protect the jury from outside influence. Even when evidence is strong, the process must be clean. Even when a defendant is disliked, the trial must be fair. Even when the public believes the verdict is right, the law still asks whether the jury reached that verdict without improper pressure. That is why the appeal matters. It does not erase what the jury heard. It does not mean Alex is innocent. It does not mean Maggie and Paul's case disappears. It means the courts must decide whether the trial process held firm under pressure. In January 2024, Judge Jean Toll denied Alex's request for a new trial after a hearing on the jury tampering allegations. She questioned Becky Hill's credibility, but found that the jurors who testified said any comments did not directly influence their verdict. That ruling kept the conviction in place, but the defense continued the fight. The South Carolina Supreme Court later agreed to review the issue. And that is why the case still has tension years after the verdict. Because Alex Murdaugh's murder convictions remain active, but the appeal asks whether the path to those convictions was legally secure. This is where the competitor transcript gets its strongest tension. It opens with the idea of a possible reversal. It pushes the viewer into uncertainty. It asks whether the case could be tried again. It brings in legal voices, emotional commentary, and questions about the financial evidence. That structure works because it does not start with history. It starts with a bombshell. But for a fact-based script, the wording must stay careful. Public records must control the story. A predicted reversal is not the same as a confirmed reversal. A legal argument is not the same as a ruling. A commentator's belief is not the same as a court order. So the strongest accurate frame is this: Alex Murdaugh was convicted. His life sentences remain active in public prison records. His federal financial crime sentence adds another layer of prison time. But his legal team continues to fight the murder convictions through appeal issues tied to jury contact and trial evidence. That is the real tension. Not rumor, record, not hype. Documented uncertainty. In the middle of this case, another fact keeps the story grounded. Even if the murder convictions were ever reversed, Alex Murdaugh would not simply walk out of prison. He pleaded guilty to financial crimes. He received a federal sentence for stealing from clients and others. He was ordered to pay restitution. The financial crime record is separate from the murder convictions. That matters because it shows how completely his public image collapsed. At the beginning, Alex was a lawyer from a powerful family. By the end, he was a convicted murderer and admitted financial criminal. But this documentary is not about making Alex larger than the victims. The victims are Maggie and Paul. Maggie Murdaugh was a wife, mother, and member of a family whose private life became public in the worst possible way. Paul Murdaugh was a son whose own legal troubles had already made him a public figure before his death. Both were killed at a place that should have been safe. Their final known moments became evidence. Their phones became witnesses. Their absence became the center of one of the most intense criminal cases in South Carolina history. The emotional weight of this story is not just that a famous lawyer fell, it is that two people died, and the legal system had to answer whether the man who called for help was also the man responsible. The investigation began in the dark. Alex called emergency services at night. Deputies responded. SLED took the lead. Crime scene teams arrived. Evidence was collected. Phones were examined. Records were gathered. At first, the public knew little. There were rumors. There were theories. There was shock. The Murdaugh name already carried attention. Then the case widened. The financial crimes came into view. The death of Gloria Satterfield, the Murdaugh family's former housekeeper, became part of the broader public story because of insurance money Alex later admitted taking. The boat crash case remained in the background. The roadside shooting involving Alex in September 2021 brought even more scrutiny. The picture became stranger and more complicated. But the murder case stayed focused on one night, June 7th. Moselle, the kennels, Maggie and Paul. Alex's statements, the video. That is why the best documentary version of this story should not get lost in every side road. The side cases matter only when they explain pressure, motive, credibility, or legal fallout. The main road is the murder timeline. The timeline begins before the emergency call. Earlier that day, according to trial evidence, pressure was already present. At the law firm, questions were being asked about money. In the civil case tied to the boat crash, financial discovery loomed. Alex's father was seriously ill. Maggie came to Moselle. Paul was there. The family had dinner. Then Maggie and Paul went to the kennels. Alex was there too, despite later saying he was not. That fact came from Paul's phone, and once the phone video placed him there, the timeline tightened. The state argued that Maggie and Paul were killed shortly after that video. Alex then left for his mother's house. He later returned to Moselle. Then he called emergency services. The defense argued the state's timeline was too tight. They argued investigators rushed to judgment. They questioned whether one person could commit the murders, clean up, leave and behave as the state suggested. They attacked the state's interpretation of the data. They said the prosecution's theory had gaps. But prosecutors leaned into the narrowness of the timeline. To them, the tight window was not a weakness. It was the point. Alex was there shortly before the killings. He lied about being there. He left. He returned. He tried to point attention toward threats connected to the boat crash. And as the evidence came in, the jury had to decide whether all of that was coincidence or consciousness of guilt. The state also presented digital evidence from phones and vehicle data. In modern true crime, technology often becomes a silent witness. Phones record movement. Cars record activity. Messages show timing. Calls show attempts to reach someone. Screens show when devices lock. Location data does not feel emotional, but it can be devastating. It does not cry. It does not argue. It does not change its story. In the Murdaugh case, digital evidence helped prosecutors place events in order. It helped them argue that Alex's timeline did not fit. It helped them support the idea that Maggie's phone moved after the killings. It helped the state turn a private family property into a mapped sequence of movements. But even with that, the trial was not simple. The defense questioned investigative decisions. They questioned collection methods. They questioned assumptions. They reminded jurors that the state had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And that burden matters. True crime often moves fast. Courtrooms do not. The state had to prove more than suspicion. It had to prove murder. That is why the kennel video became the emotional and evidentiary center. Everything else may feel complex. The video feels simple. Alex said he was not there. The video showed he was. When a case is crowded with money, lawsuits, addiction, family history and public scandal, jurors need a clear anchor. Paul's phone gave them one. The cruel irony is hard to miss. Paul did not record that video to expose his father. He recorded it for an ordinary reason. But after his death, it became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. A son's phone contradicted his father. A small moment became the hinge of a murder trial. And because Alex was a lawyer, his lie carried even more force. He knew that being at the kennels mattered. He knew investigators would build a timeline. He knew that the last person near victims before death draws attention. So when he said he was not there, prosecutors argued that it was not confusion. It was strategy. Alex's explanation was that he lied because he was paranoid. He said his addiction made him distrustful of law enforcement. He said he panicked. That was his answer. The jury did not accept it. They convicted him. But the appeal does not focus only on whether jurors believed him. It focuses on whether they reached that decision through a process untouched by improper influence. That is a different question, and it is why the case remains legally alive. If this video gives you clear, fact-based coverage without rumors, take a second to like the video and subscribe to True Crime Investigator Alex. This channel follows the evidence, respects the victims, and keeps the story grounded in documented records. The appeal fight matters because of one principle. A guilty person still has a right to a fair trial. That is not a technicality. It is the foundation of the system. If a court clerk improperly influenced jurors, the issue becomes serious. If jurors were not influenced, the verdict stands stronger. That is why the hearings around Becky Hill drew so much attention. At the hearing, jurors were questioned. Some testimony raised concern. Other testimony supported the idea that the verdict came from the evidence. Judge Toll denied the new trial request. But she did not treat every part of the clerk's conduct as clean. That tension created the next chapter. The defense kept pushing. The state defended the conviction. The Supreme Court review became the new courtroom battle. And suddenly, the story that began at Moselle was also about the integrity of the trial itself. For audiences, that creates a difficult split. Many people see the kennel video and believe the verdict was right. Others look at the clerk allegations and say the process must matter even if the evidence looked strong. Both ideas can exist in tension. A fact-based documentary should not pretend the appeal is meaningless. It should also not pretend the appeal erases the evidence. The honest version is this: the evidence convicted Alex Murdaugh. The appeal challenges whether the conviction was reached through a fair enough process to stand. That is the legal battlefield. The financial evidence creates another appellate issue. During trial, jurors heard about Alex stealing money from clients and his law firm. They heard about betrayal. They heard about vulnerable people being cheated. They heard about a lawyer using trust as a weapon. That evidence made Alex look dishonest and desperate. The prosecution said that was exactly why it mattered. The defense said it turned the murder trial into a character trial. The Supreme Court's interest in that issue matters because trial courts must balance relevance against unfair prejudice. If financial evidence explains motive, it can be powerful. If it overwhelms the murder evidence, it can become dangerous. That is why the case is legally complex. Public opinion often focuses on guilt. Appeals focus on process. The public asks, did he do it? The appellate court asks, was the trial legally fair? Those are related questions, but they are not the same. Alex Murdaugh's story sits at the intersection of both. Now go back to the night itself. A family property, a husband, a wife, a son, a phone video, a short window, an emergency call. When Alex first spoke to investigators, he said he had last seen Maggie and Paul earlier. He did not place himself at the kennels with them moments before the killings. For a long time, that statement shaped the public understanding. Then, the video changed it. At trial, Alex admitted his earlier statements were false. That admission did something important. It removed any real debate over whether he had lied about the kennels. The debate became why. The prosecution said he lied because he was guilty. The defense said he lied because he was paranoid, addicted, and afraid. Jurors had to decide which explanation made sense with everything else. And everything else included the financial pressure, the boat crash lawsuit, the missing funds, the timing, the phone data, the vehicle data, the emergency call, the quick attempt to suggest outside revenge. The state's case was like a chain. No single link carried everything. But together, prosecutors argued, the links formed a clear picture. The defense tried to break that chain. They did not need to prove who else did it. They needed to create reasonable doubt. They challenged the investigation. They questioned whether law enforcement protected the scene properly. They challenged the idea that Alex had enough time. They argued that the state's motive theory was unnatural. They asked why a man would kill the very people he claimed to love just to delay financial exposure. That question still disturbs people, because the state's motive theory is not ordinary. It is not a simple argument about anger. It is an argument about control, image, exposure, desperation, a life built on deception finally closing in. Prosecutors did not have to prove motive as a legal element of murder, but jurors often want to understand why. Why would this happen? Why that night? Why Maggie and Paul? The state's answer was pressure. The defense's answer was that pressure does not equal murder. That was the conflict. But when Alex took the stand and admitted to years of lying and stealing, the prosecution gained a direct way to argue that his public image was false. The jury did not see only a grieving father. They saw a lawyer who admitted betraying people. They saw a man who admitted lying to police about the kennels. They saw someone who said he loved Maggie and Paul, but had hidden his presence near them at the most important moment of the case. That is why his testimony may have hurt him. It gave the jury a voice, a face, and an explanation. Then it gave prosecutors the chance to take that explanation apart. By the time jurors began deliberating, they had heard weeks of evidence. Yet their decision came quickly. Less than 3 hours after a 6-week trial, they found him guilty. That speed shocked many viewers. But legal observers noted that the case may have become simple for the jury because of the kennel video and Alex's own testimony. A long trial had narrowed into a short question. If Alex lied about being at the kennels, what else was he hiding? The verdict was read. Alex stood in court. The family name that once carried power now sat under the weight of a murder conviction. Judge Newman sentenced him to life in prison, and the public story moved from mystery to judgment. But Maggie and Paul's story did not end cleanly. The appeal pulled the case back into uncertainty, not because the victims changed, not because the video disappeared, not because Alex withdrew his admissions about lying and financial crimes, but because the court system had to examine whether the trial itself had been compromised. That is where the case becomes uncomfortable. A viewer may believe Alex is guilty and still understand why jury integrity matters. A viewer may think the evidence was strong and still ask whether a clerk's conduct crossed a line. That is what makes the next stage so tense. The murder case is no longer only about evidence from Moselle. It is about whether the verdict can withstand scrutiny outside Moselle. The current public record shows Alex Murdaugh remains incarcerated with active life sentences for murder. He also carries serious financial crime consequences. That means any discussion of retrial must be framed carefully. A possible retrial is not freedom. A possible reversal is not innocence. A successful appeal on trial process grounds would mean the state may have to try the murder case again under proper rules. And public reporting has indicated prosecutors would pursue another trial if the convictions were reversed. That matters because the state's position appears clear. They believe the evidence remains strong. They believe the case can be tried again. And they believe Maggie and Paul still deserve a courtroom answer that survives appeal. But a retrial, if ever ordered, would raise major questions. Would the financial evidence be limited? Would the jury hear the same full story of Alex's thefts? Would the state focus more tightly on the kennel video and digital timeline? Would the defense build a cleaner argument around investigation gaps? Would Alex testify again? Would a new jury respond the same way without the same amount of financial crime testimony? Those questions are why the appeal has so much power. A retrial would not be a replay. It would be a new battle over what evidence comes in, how the timeline is presented, and whether jurors see Alex mainly as a man at the kennels or as a man whose entire life of deception was collapsing. That distinction could shape everything. The first trial gave the state room to tell a broad story. A second trial, depending on appellate guidance, might force a narrower story. But the kennel video would still be central, because no matter how the financial evidence is handled, the video remains the moment Alex's account broke. He said he was not there. The recording placed him there. He later admitted the lie. That core fact does not vanish. The defense would still have to explain it. The prosecution would still make it the spine of the case. The audience should understand this clearly. The appeal does not make the kennel video meaningless. It asks whether the trial around that evidence was fair. And fairness is not a side issue. Fairness is what allows a verdict to stand. That is the deeper theme. The Murdaugh case is a story of trust collapsing at every level. A husband's trust, a father's trust, a client's trust, a law firm's trust, a community's trust, and then, through the appeal, the court system's trust. The state said, Alex betrayed everyone around him. The defense said the state turned a dishonest man into a murderer without direct proof. The jury chose the state's version. The appellate fight asks whether that choice was protected from improper influence. That is why this case still grips people. It has evidence, it has power, it has money, it has a family dynasty. It has a phone video that feels almost impossible in its timing. It has a defendant who admitted lying but denied murder. It has a verdict that came fast. And it has an appeal that keeps the ending unsettled. But through every legal argument, the center should remain Maggie and Paul. Maggie's final day should not be reduced to a motive theory. Paul's final phone video should not be treated as a plot twist only. They were people. Their deaths turned private grief into public evidence. Their final known moments became part of a national courtroom story. And the justice system still carries the responsibility of getting the case right. That responsibility is heavy because the case has become symbolic. For some, it is about the fall of privilege. For others, it is about a powerful man finally facing consequences. For others, it is about whether public pressure and media attention can distort justice. For the families connected to the wider Murdaugh story, it is about loss, betrayal, and accountability. And for viewers, it is a warning about how carefully image can hide collapse. Alex Murdaugh did not look like a man on the edge of complete ruin to everyone around him. That is part of what makes the story so disturbing. He had a name people recognized. He had a career people respected. He had a family people saw as powerful. But behind that image, prosecutors showed a different record. The record of stolen money, the record of lies, the record of pressure, the record of an alibi that could not survive one phone video. When people ask why the Murdaugh case became so famous, the answer is not only the murder. Many murder cases never receive this level of attention. The Murdaugh case became famous because it exposed layers. First, a double murder, then a powerful family, then a boat crash, then missing money, then client theft, then a roadside shooting scandal, then a trial, then a guilty verdict, then a jury tampering claim, then a possible appeal outcome that could reopen the murder case. Every layer made the public ask the same thing. How much was hidden? And who protected it for so long? That question gives the story its documentary force. The Murdaugh name was not only a last name. In South Carolina's Low Country, it represented influence. The family's legal roots reached deep. People knew the name in courtrooms. They knew the name in law offices. They knew the name in local power structures. That kind of influence can shape how people act around a case. It can affect assumptions. It can create hesitation. It can make ordinary facts feel politically charged. When Maggie and Paul were killed, investigators had to work a case where the caller was not just any caller. He was Alex Murdaugh, a lawyer, a man from a legal dynasty, a man whose family had long ties to the prosecution system in that region. That does not prove guilt, but it explains why the investigation drew so much attention. People wanted to know whether power would protect him. In the end, the jury convicted him, but the appeal asks whether another kind of power entered the room, the power of a court official near the jury. That is why the case feels like a circle. It starts with influence. It ends with a fight over influence. The state argued Alex used influence and deception for years. The defense now argues the trial process itself was influenced improperly. At each stage, trust is the issue. Can the family story be trusted? Can Alex's statements be trusted? Can the financial record be trusted? Can the investigation be trusted? Can the jury process be trusted? The answer to each question changes the story. On the night of the killings, Alex's first major claim was that he had discovered the bodies after returning home. But public records show SLED documented that he called emergency services and said he had returned to the family property and found Maggie and Paul. That first call became the doorway into the case. It also became part of the performance question. Was Alex reacting to a horror he discovered, or was he controlling the first version of the story? A jury later decided the second version matched the evidence. But in a low-risk, fact-based documentary, the language should stay tied to the verdict. A jury found him guilty. Alex maintains he did not kill them. He admitted lying about being at the kennels. He admitted financial crimes. Those facts are enough. The story does not need unsupported claims. The evidence already carries the tension. Consider how the state's case lands when told plainly. Alex said he was not at the kennels. A video put him there. He said he had no reason to harm Maggie and Paul. The state said his life was collapsing under financial exposure. He suggested threats connected to the boat crash. The state said that claim redirected attention away from him. He said he lied because of paranoia. The jury rejected his explanation. That is a strong case narrative without adding rumor. The power is in the contrast. Statement versus video. Image versus reality. Trust versus theft. Grief versus timeline. Trial verdict versus appeal. The competitor transcript uses outrage, rapid expert commentary, and repeated pressure to keep the audience engaged. For this script, the better approach is controlled tension. Do not scream at the audience. Let the contradictions tighten. Let the facts stack. Let each new piece make the last one more uncomfortable. That is how a James Janney-style hook works in true crime. It does not begin with a full biography. It begins with a question the viewer cannot let go. Why did Alex Murdaugh lie about being at the kennels? Once the viewer cares about that question, the script can widen. It can bring in the family name, the financial crimes, the boat crash, the legal strategy, the trial, the appeal, but the anchor must stay clear. The phone video broke the story. Everything else explains why that break mattered. Now follow the evidence from the jury's point of view. They heard that Maggie and Paul were killed near the kennels. They heard that Alex called emergency services after returning to Moselle. They heard that he told investigators he had not been at the kennels shortly before the killings. They heard the kennel video. They heard witnesses identify the voices. They heard Alex admit on the stand that he lied. They heard about his financial crimes. They heard the state's motive theory. They heard the defense attack the investigation and the lack of direct physical evidence. Then they watched Alex himself. A trial is not only documents, it is presence. Jurors watch how a person answers. They watch what he admits. They watch what he avoids. They compare the testimony to the evidence. Alex tried to explain his lies. The state tried to show the lies were part of guilt. In the end, the jury took less than 3 hours. That short deliberation became part of the story. After weeks of testimony, they did not need days. They did not need a long standoff. They returned guilty verdicts. For the prosecution, that speed showed clarity. For the defense, the fight moved to appeal. The sentencing brought another layer of finality. Life in prison. No parole on the murder sentences. Then, financial sentences added even more prison time. The man who once stood inside courtrooms as a lawyer became the defendant whose own words helped convict him. But if the legal system has one lesson, it is that verdicts do not always silence questions. The questions change shape. Before trial, the question was whether Alex would be convicted. After trial, the question became whether the conviction would survive appeal. And now, public attention turns to the South Carolina Supreme Court and the issues raised by the defense. Jury influence, courtroom conduct, financial evidence, trial fairness. Each issue matters because the case is too important to rest on shaky ground. For Maggie and Paul, justice must be durable. For the public, confidence matters. For the defendant, rights matter. That is the uncomfortable truth of the system. A case can have strong evidence and still require careful review. That does not weaken justice. It protects it. If the conviction stands, it stands stronger because the appellate process tested it. If a new trial is ordered, the state must present its case again under the rules the higher court sets. Either way, the evidence at Moselle remains the heart of the story. The video remains the turning point. The lie remains the question. The financial pressure remains the state's motive, and the victims remain at the center. One of the reasons this case keeps drawing viewers is that the murder itself is not the only mystery. The deeper mystery is how Alex Murdaugh lived so long behind a trusted image while financial crimes grew underneath. The federal case revealed serious theft from clients and others. Those crimes were not minor mistakes. They involved real victims and real money. The federal sentence showed that even outside the murder case, Alex's legal downfall was severe. That matters for the documentary because it explains why prosecutors saw desperation. They were not asking jurors to believe that a stable man suddenly lost control for no reason. They were asking jurors to see a man whose hidden crimes were being exposed. But a fair script should also state the defense's response. The defense said financial crimes do not equal murder. They said the state used Alex's admitted thefts to make jurors hate him. They said the prosecution still had to prove who killed Maggie and Paul. They said no murder weapon was recovered as trial evidence. They said there was no direct eyewitness to the killings. They said the timeline was flawed. That defense argument is part of the record. But the jury did not accept it. The jury accepted the state's chain of circumstantial evidence. And in criminal law, circumstantial evidence can convict when it proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That is another important point for viewers. Some people hear circumstantial and think weak. That is not always true. A fingerprint can be circumstantial. A phone location can be circumstantial. A lie about being at the crime scene can be circumstantial. Circumstantial evidence becomes powerful when each piece points in the same direction. The state argued that was exactly what happened. The kennel video placed Alex at the scene. His statements denied it. His later testimony admitted the denial was false. The financial evidence showed pressure. The digital evidence helped build timing. The jury believed the pattern. The defense saw reasonable doubt. The jury saw guilt. That is the courtroom result. Now consider the victim's final known timeline. Maggie and Paul were together near the kennels. Paul's phone captured a short video. Alex's voice was identified. Minutes later, Maggie and Paul were dead. Alex left Moselle for his mother's house. He returned. He called emergency services. He mentioned threats tied to the boat crash. That sequence, as argued by the state, gave the prosecution its path. It also gave the documentary its structure. A high tension open at the kennels, a rewind into pressure, a return to the phone video, a courtroom battle over lies and motive, a verdict, then the appeal. That structure keeps retention high because each section answers one question and opens another. Question 1. Why did the emergency call sound wrong to investigators? Answer. Because Alex's story would later conflict with the evidence. Question 2. What evidence broke the story? Answer. Paul's phone video. Question 3. Why would Alex lie? Answer. He said paranoia. Prosecutors said guilt. Question 4. Why would prosecutors argue motive? Answer. Financial exposure and pressure. Question 5. Why is the case still alive after conviction? Answer. Appeal issues tied to jury contact and financial evidence. That is a clean retention chain. It does not need unsupported claims. It does not need graphic detail. It does not need invented dialogue. The public record is enough. The emotional force comes from the contradictions. A father says he was not there. A dead son's phone says he was. A lawyer says he should be believed. His own testimony shows years of deception. A jury says guilty. An appeal asks whether the jury process was clean. That is the story, and it is more powerful when told with restraint. A good, true crime script does not need to insult the defendant. It does not need to diagnose him. It does not need to claim what only a court can decide. It can show what the records show. It can say the jury convicted him. It can say he denies the murders. It can say he admitted financial crimes. It can say his alibi changed after the video emerged. It can say the appeal remains a serious legal issue. The audience will feel the tension without being forced. Now the story moves to the human cost. Maggie and Paul died at Moselle. Mallory Beach had died years earlier in the boat crash case connected to Paul. Clients lost money through Alex's financial crimes. Gloria Satterfield's family became part of the wider Murdaugh financial scandal. The case is filled with people harmed by the collapse of one powerful family's public image. That is why the documentary should avoid treating the story as entertainment only. It is gripping, it is dramatic, it is full of twists. But at the center are real deaths, real families, and real harm. The legal system must handle that with care. For Alex Murdaugh, the courtroom became the place where decades of trust fell apart. He could no longer stand only as a lawyer. He stood as a defendant. He could no longer control the questions. He had to answer them. And when he answered, he admitted the lie the state needed him to admit. Yes, he had been at the kennels. Yes, he had lied about it. No, he said, he did not kill Maggie and Paul. That testimony gave the jury the final version of his defense from his own mouth, and they rejected it. The speed of the verdict made the trial feel decisive, but the appeal makes the story feel unfinished. That is the tension of the current Murdaugh case. Not whether the first jury reached a verdict. They did, not whether Alex remains imprisoned. Public records show he does. The question is whether the conviction will remain untouched after higher court review. That question is important enough to handle carefully. If the Supreme Court leaves the convictions in place, the documentary ending is one of legal endurance. If the court orders a new proceeding or a new trial, the story shifts into a second courtroom war. But no matter what happens next, one fact will remain central. Paul's phone changed everything. Without that video, the state still may have argued financial pressure and timeline issues. But with the video, the jury saw the lie. It heard the contradiction. It had a clear moment where Alex's story failed. That is why the opening hook should always return to the phone. The phone did not solve every question. It exposed the question that mattered most. Why did he lie? From that question, the entire documentary unfolds. The emergency call becomes more than panic. The boat crash mention becomes more than background. The financial evidence becomes more than scandal. The trial testimony becomes more than denial. The appeal becomes more than legal procedure. It all connects to the same broken claim. I was not there, but he was. That is the sentence that haunts the case. He was there. The jury heard it. Alex admitted it. And once he admitted it, he had to explain why his first story was false. His explanation did not save him. The state's theory prevailed. The verdict came. The sentence followed. Then, the appeal began. The Murdaugh case now sits in a rare place. It is both resolved and unresolved. Resolved because a jury convicted him and the prison record shows active sentences. Unresolved because legal challenges remain and public reporting continues to watch for the next court decision. That makes it perfect for a documentary that opens with tension and ends with a question. The question is not, did the first jury convict him? Yes. The question is, will that conviction survive the full weight of appeal? And if it does not, what happens when the state has to tell the story of Moselle all over again? A second trial would test whether the same evidence lands the same way with a new jury. It would test how much financial crime evidence comes in. It would test whether the kennel video remains enough to anchor the state's case. It would test whether Alex's own words can hurt him again. It would test whether the defense can create reasonable doubt around timing, investigation, and motive. And it would force everyone back to the night of June 7th. Back to Moselle. Back to the kennels. Back to Maggie and Paul. Back to the phone. That is why the story has not faded. The public remembers the verdict, but the law remembers the process. And in this case, both matter. For the final documentary beat, the narration should return to contrast. Alex Murdaugh built a life on language, law, and trust. But the case against him turned on the simplest kind of contradiction. He said one thing, the evidence showed another. The rest of the case asked jurors what that contradiction meant. Was it panic? Was it paranoia? Was it guilt? The jury answered guilty. The appeal now asks whether that answer was reached fairly. And until the courts finish that question, the Murdaugh story remains one of the most unsettling true crime cases in modern American history. Because the most damaging witness was not a stranger. It was not an enemy. It was not a rival. It was Paul Murdaugh's own phone. A small recording. A few voices. A moment no one knew would matter. And a lie that could not survive it. If you want more clear, evidence-based true crime stories like this video and subscribe to True Crime Investigator Alex. We follow the facts, protect the victim's dignity, and separate documented truth from rumor. Maggie and Paul Murdaugh's case began with an emergency call in the dark. It moved through a family dynasty. It exposed financial crimes. It pulled in a boat crash lawsuit. It forced a powerful lawyer to answer questions under oath. It ended, for now, with guilty verdicts and life sentences. But the final word still belongs to the courts. And the haunting question remains the same. If Alex Murdaugh had nothing to hide that night, why did his dead son's phone prove he had lied?